the Red Keep, Cersei was furious with Joffrey's impulsive choice. She had hoped to keep Ned alive, to trade him for Jaime, who was now a prisoner of Robb Stark. Tyrion was still away in the Vale, or on the road somewhere, so the Queen had no cunning ally to counsel her except Baelish. Late that night, she summoned Petyr to the Queen's Solar. There, she demanded to know how the city could be stabilized, how they could quell any rebellion in the north. Petyr assured her that all was not lost, that they could forge alliances with the Freys, or with Roose Bolton, or sow discord among the northern lords. The Queen might not have liked the suggestions, but she was too desperate to do anything but listen. "We can handle the north," Petyr said, with that confident tilt of his head. "We only need the gold to keep our swords fed. And gold, my queen, is what I can provide." Sansa Stark was confined to her chambers, a broken spirit. Arya was gone, vanished into the streets. Robb Stark, upon hearing the news, would muster an army and march south. But Petyr was content with that. The War of the Five Kings, as it would come to be known, was about to erupt in all its savage glory. Everyone else saw war as a tragedy or a necessity, but Petyr saw it as a ladder. Every rung would be an alliance to form, a betrayal to orchestrate, a step that brought him closer to unassailable power. Let the realms drown in blood, so long as Petyr Baelish could stand upon the rubble with a smirk. And so he went about his daily routines in the battered city, wearing the face of a weary official who only wanted to keep the peace. He attended small council meetings, consoling the Queen, cajoling Pycelle, bandying words with Varys. He reopened the brothels that had shuttered after the chaos of Ned's execution, investing funds to keep the business flowing. With Robert gone, fewer men felt the need to keep up old forms of courtesy, and darker appetites bubbled to the surface. Petyr made sure to offer exactly what they wanted. He pocketed coin and secrets in equal measure. Each new rumor gleaned from bedchamber whispers. The city was a tinderbox, but Petyr had the flint in hand. He also began to reach beyond the capital. Letters went out under cryptic seals to the Vale, where Lysa Arryn, Catelyn's sister, ruled as regent for her young son. Petyr knew Lysa was hopelessly infatuated with him. He planned to use that. If war covered the land, the Vale would remain neutral only so long, and if Petyr could bring them into the conflict at a critical moment, it might secure him yet another rung on that endless ladder to power. Meanwhile, he dangled the possibility of an alliance to the Tyrells in Highgarden, who might prefer to throw in their lot with the Lannisters if it suited them, or might want to break free if the Lannisters were weakened. Petyr did not commit to either side. He simply allowed them to know he could open pathways for them. Money, marriage prospects, or the removal of a rival. The tidbits of intelligence he possessed made him a broker of futures. All the while, he cultivated Joffrey's favor in small ways. A flattery here, a suggestion there. Joffrey was a cruel boy, easily flattered and quick to anger. Petyr feigned a measure of respect, though in truth he found the young king repellent. Joffrey's unpredictable sadism was a liability. But Petyr wanted to remain close to the throne so that he could tip events as needed. And if something unfortunate befell Joffrey, well, there was still Tommen or Myrcella or whoever might claim the throne next. The point was to be indispensable, not to tie himself too tightly to one monarch. In the quiet hours, Petyr sometimes thought of Catelyn Stark. He wondered how she grieved the loss of her husband. He recalled the time, so many years past, when he had dueled Brandon Stark for her favor and lost miserably. The sting of that humiliation had never faded. And in a twisted way, he took satisfaction in the knowledge that he had brought about the ruin of House Stark's patriarch. Yet a small corner of his mind felt a flicker of regret. He once had a genuine affection for Cat, but that was overshadowed by his ambition. His unrelenting desire to stand above the great houses that once looked down on him as a lowly upstart from a small, unimportant house in the Fingers. Let them scorn, let them sneer. He would bury them all if it meant climbing higher. As the days turned to weeks, the city adjusted to the new, uneasy reality. Ned Stark's head rotted on a spike over the walls, a grim warning to all. Some of the small folk declared Ned a martyr, whispering that his ghost would haunt the Red Keep. The Lannisters walked with an air of triumph, though they were plagued by the rumor that Jaime was a captive. The Gold Cloaks patrolled the streets, occasionally cracking down on unruly mobs. Peter moved like a ghost among them, never drawing attention to his manipulations. If the Lannisters suspected any disloyalty, Peter smoothed their doubts with the assurance of coin and the promise of more. If any other factions in the city had reason to doubt him, Peter slipped them a secret or a rumor or a minor favor that bound them to him. He was weaving a web as strong as any spider's, though he let Varys keep the title of Master of Whisperers. Peter was something else entirely. He took advantage of the North's righteous fury. With Ned beheaded, Robb Stark was declared king in the North, shattering the unity of the Seven Kingdoms. That alone was a victory for Peter, who wanted the realm broken into pieces. But he saw another opportunity, forging alliances with the Riverlands. If the Tullys aligned with Robb, the Lannisters would push war deeper into the Trident. Baelish's own modest birth in the Riverlands gave him just enough connection to slip in as a negotiator, or so he planned. He would offer to coordinate bribes to certain river lords who might otherwise remain neutral. In exchange, he would tighten his hold on the region's finance and influence. It was all part of a grand design, one that required Ned Stark's head to be firmly separated from his shoulders. One evening, as he walked along the silent corridors of the Red Keep, Peter encountered Sansa Stark by chance. She was escorted by a pair of guards, her eyes rimmed red from tears. She froze when she saw him. Peter gave a small bow, adopting a solemn expression. She stared at him with something akin to hatred. Though she did not know the details of his betrayal, she knew he was no friend to her father, that he had not saved Ned in his darkest hour. She bit her lip and turned away, letting the guards hurry her along. Peter felt no remorse. She was another piece in the game, a precious hostage for the Lannisters, but a potential bride for some lordly alliance. Maybe even his own if the winds blew that way. He would keep an eye on her. After all, Cat's daughter might prove valuable if the plan required an alternative claim to the north. Meanwhile, the small council grew narrower. Pycelle dithered, old and half-deaf. Varys smiled, offering half-truths. The new hand, if one could call him that, was an increasingly desperate figure. Cersei couldn't trust her brother Tyrion while he was absent, so she tried to rule herself with Joffrey. Chaos thrived. Peter presented the kingdom's finances with carefully curated pages, always explaining that the war was expensive but necessary, that new loans were needed from the Iron Bank. Each new loan was another chain upon the crown, forging a debt that would ensure Peter's continuing power. The queen sometimes snarled at the numbers, but she had no alternative if she meant to pay her soldiers and keep the city afloat. Peter politely reminded her that controlling the money was the only way to control the realm. The weeks marched on, a funeral dirge for the illusions of peace. Word reached the capital that Robb Stark had won a victory at Riverrun, capturing Jaime Lannister. Tywin Lannister had marched south, leaving behind a charred path in the Riverlands. Renly Baratheon, youngest brother to the late king, had declared himself king in Highgarden, forging an alliance with the Tyrells. Stannis, grim and unyielding, raised his banners at Dragonstone, proclaiming himself the only true king. It was madness, a swirl of competing claims. Each new rumor spelled fresh misery for the small folk. But for Peter, it was the sweet sound of opportunity. He kept a map in his office, marking each holdfast and seat of power. In the stillness of evening, by candlelight, he would trace potential paths to each region, ways to influence or sow disruption. The kingdom's very fragmentation was a stepping stone for him. He also recognized that eventually the war would wind down. One side would gain advantage, the others would be forced to concede or die. Peter wanted to ensure that, whichever side emerged victorious, he would be on the winning side. But more than that, he wanted to shape the realm to his liking. A realm where Peter Baelish was indispensable, perhaps even unstoppable. He thought about his next moves carefully. Perhaps he would feign loyalty to the Lannisters a bit longer, then pivot to support the Tyrells if Renly seemed poised to triumph. Or maybe he would sabotage the Tyrells if Stannis looked more promising. The calculus changed daily, but Peter thrived on it. In the immediate aftermath of Ned Stark's death, though, Peter's advantage was absolute. He had removed the honorable fool who would never compromise. He had the city watch in his pocket, or at least enough of them to matter. He had the trust, albeit grudging, of Cersei, who needed him to keep the realm financially afloat. And he had a network of informants, both in the city and beyond, that no one else rivaled. Even Varys, for all his birds, could not claim the financial leverage Peter possessed. It was a precarious balance, but Peter balanced it well. When the first snows fell in the north, unnoticed by the sunny capital, Peter looked out from a balcony in the Red Keep at the city below. The hustle and bustle, the cries of merchants, the clang of distant forge hammers. It was all the heartbeat of King's Landing. Beneath the surface, fear roiled, spurred by the heads on spikes over the battlements. The knowledge that an army from the north might come at any time. Some whispered that Greyjoys might rise from the Iron Islands, that Daenerys Targaryen might cross the sea with dragons. Rumors soared on every wind. Peter let them swirl, carefully funneling the ones he wanted to the right ears. He pictured Ned Stark's final moment, the look of resignation in the man's eyes. That was the difference, Peter thought. Eddard Stark was a decent man in an indecent world. Peter was an indecent man, all but unstoppable in a realm that devoured innocence. He felt no pang of guilt. Instead, he thought of the future. When the time came, he would move to secure Harrenhal or even the Eyrie, if he could wrap Lisa Arryn around his finger. He would wait for the opportune moment to betray the Lannisters as well, once they were weakened by the war. And if the war did not weaken them enough, he would find ways to ensure it did. Each passing day was a step closer to that grand scheme. Cersei tried to keep a leash on him, but her own arrogance blinded her to the real threat. She thought him a useful tool, easily cast aside once she no longer needed him. But Peter Baelish knew that knowledge was power and power was ephemeral. Gold might buy loyalty in the short term, but cunning was what held it all together. He told himself that one day, he would stand on top of the remains of these great houses. Stark, Lannister, Baratheon, Tully, Tyrell, and laugh. To the victor go the spoils. There were moments when he had to hide his satisfaction. For instance, late one evening, Sansa was brought before the small council to recant the charges of treason against her father and beg for clemency for her brother. The poor girl trembled, tears shining in her eyes. King Joffrey laughed at her pleas, threatened to have her beaten. Cersei put on a show of maternal concern, telling Sansa that if Robb bent the knee, all would be forgiven. Sansa, all but broken, swore her brother would do so. The entire performance was as pitiful as it was pointless. Peter observed from the sidelines, offering neither comfort nor condemnation, merely storing the memory. One day, Sansa Stark's value might skyrocket if Robb Stark became powerful enough. Or if the tides shifted in another way. Peter was patient. Behind closed doors, Peter met with the city's moneylenders, quietly negotiating interest rates and new lines of credit. War was expensive and someone had to pay. He made sure that each loan to the crown came through a funnel that he controlled, taking his cut. When he returned to the small council, he presented the final sums as if they were an inevitable necessity. Cersei would nod grudgingly, Pycelle would murmur something about the realm's good, and the king would simply ignore it all, playing with his crossbow or tormenting small animals. Meanwhile, Peter's personal coffers grew. He improved his brothels, quietly acquired property near the docks, and established a web of trade partners. Let the war rage on. Peter would be ready to profit when the caravans changed routes, when ports closed and reopened. He spoke to ship captains about supply lines for the Lannisters' armies, offering them bribes to favor certain merchant houses. The deeper the city sank into conflict, the more strings Peter could pull. He also had an audience with Lancel Lannister, King Robert's former squire and now a toady for Cersei. Lancel was feeble-minded, full of pride and gullibility. Peter flattered him, found out that Lancel had been giving Robert strong wine during the hunt on the Queen's orders. The boar's goring was no simple accident. Peter filed that knowledge away like a polished gem. If Cersei ever tried to unseat him, he would leak that secret. And if the time ever came to play the role of avenger for King Robert, Peter could produce the evidence of her involvement. So it went. Each day, more secrets, more webs. Eddard Stark's death was the pivot upon which all of this turned. The second pivot would come in time, perhaps with the death of another king, or the triumph of a new claimant. Peter was in no rush. Each event was a rung on his ladder, and he ascended carefully, step by step, ensuring he did not slip. In the background, the realm slid toward devastation. Battles erupted in the riverlands, and farmers were turned into refugees overnight. Children starved in the fields. The rotting bodies of the slain perfumed the roads. The War of the Five Kings was a monstrous, sprawling affair. Yet in the Red Keep, banquets continued, lesser lords hoping to curry favor with the crown. Dances were held, jugglers performed, and fools in motley sang bawdy songs. Baelish attended them all, a half-smile on his lips, exchanging courtesies with men who might be dead by this time next moon. He was living proof that the illusions of civilization can persist while the world burned. And how did he feel about that? Satisfied. Every shred of chaos favored him, so long as he maintained enough control to navigate it. He was not a typical lord who marched to war, nor did he have a daughter to marry off for alliances. His only weapons were cunning, gold, and an utter lack of scruples, which was more than enough considering the competition. The Lannisters, for all their might, had enemies on every side. The Tyrells wanted to overshadow them, the Starks wanted vengeance, the Baratheon brothers each wanted the Iron Throne. Against this swirling tide, Peter Baelish floated, unpredictable, elusive, unstoppable. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he remembered the day Ned Stark arrived in King's Landing. Such solemn pride in his eyes, such unbending loyalty to his family. He had walked into the city believing truth and honor would be enough to set things right. Peter's soft chuckle echoed in his private chamber when he recalled how naive that notion was. In the great game, only those who recognized the power of illusions prevailed. And illusions were Littlefinger's specialty. He wove illusions for the realm, illusions for the small folk, illusions even for kings and queens. He was both the stagehand and the playwright, lighting the stage as he saw fit. Ned had been a good man, but good men rarely survive such a stage. When the messenger from the north arrived, bearing word of Robb Stark's victories, Peter read the dispatch with mild interest. The young wolf, they called him. Another player on the board, another force to be harnessed or destroyed. Peter considered sending a letter to Catelyn, offering his condolences, reminding her that he was her friend. Perhaps he would weave a tale of how he tried to save Ned at the last moment, only to be thwarted by the Lannisters. Yes, that might be enough to sow some doubt in her mind, make her think Peter was an ally. The letter practically wrote itself in his head. A sorrowful lament for the loss of an honorable man, a subtle reminder of childhood memories in Riverrun. Even if she believed him partially, it might stay her hand. And if she came within reach, Peter could manipulate her, maybe even seduce her, though her grief would be a formidable barrier. Even so, it was worth a try. Every relationship was a potential investment. Thus, in the quiet that followed the public fury of Ned's execution, Peter Baelish continued to spin his webs, forging alliances in shadow, fueling resentments among the lords, and positioning himself to thrive in the war to come. He strolled through the castle with an easy smile, exchanging pleasantries with lords and ladies, commiserating over the horror of war. He wore the mask of a sympathetic official who only wanted peace, but behind that mask was the grin of a man who had orchestrated events from the start. In conversation, he might sigh that none wanted Ned's death, that it was a cruel necessity once Ned had threatened the throne. He might shake his head at Joffrey's caprice, while slyly praising the boy's decisive action. To others, he murmured that the queen was truly the one holding power, and if they had any sense, they would curry favor with her. A different story for each listener, a tapestry of half-truths that only Peter understood completely. No one objected openly, because in the end, Peter Baelish had placed himself beyond reproach. The gold flowed through him, the city watch followed him, the secrets whispered in his ear. With Ned Stark's head rotting on the walls, there was no hero left to challenge Peter's cunning. The game was his to play, the realm his to manipulate. And so, piece by piece, Littlefinger won the opening moves in the grand battle for the Iron Throne.